The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists conducted an investigation that can hardly be called truly sensational. But if it is a sensation, then it is at least several centuries old and boils down to a rather simple truth. Everywhere Russia goes, it creates a gulag. Some export flowers, others their cuisine, and some export prisons and camps filled with torture and humiliation. This time we are talking about Africa, about Mali. Journalists have discovered that the so-called private military company Wagner, which of course has always been nothing more than a branch of the Russian security services, has established an entire network of secret prisons in these African country prisons that even the Malian military, who used Russian support to stage a coup and seize control of their own country, could not influence. Eyewitnesses report that Wagner operatives set up prisons in a number of cities across the country, cities that they essentially controlled. Some of these prisons are even located on official Malian military bases, once again with no access whatsoever for Malian army officers or the country's own leaders to what is happening there. Wagner operatives establish prisons almost everywhere they go. At the same time, former inmates of these prisons recount a whole range of torture methods used by killers from Prigozhin's military company. Beatings with electric cables, waterboarding, metal containers left under the scorching African sun, electric shocks, forced labor, and starvation torture. And by the way, I think it will be especially interesting for all fans of the Russian world to know that Wagner mercenaries usually tortured prisoners to Russian music. So greetings to Iosif Kobzon, Babkina, and Dima Bilan. Their work is, so to speak, in demand out of necessity. And this too can truly be called a genuine export of culture. We've always wondered, what's the point of Russian pop music? Why do we need all this chanson, all these Shufutinskys, and other performers singing about a hard life? It's so that to the sounds of these songs familiar to every resident of the Russian Federation and the surrounding regions, people can be tortured with hunger, electric shocks, or beaten with sticks, so that, by the way, the sounds of torture aren't so easily heard outside the prison walls, and so that the cries of the unfortunate prisoners can't be heard. So you could say that Russian culture has finally found its remarkable refuge in the torture chambers and prisons on the territory of Mali. And of course, the fact that Russia has set up a gulag in Mali is yet another reminder of the consequences that follow wherever Russia arrives. What is happening in Africa is strikingly reminiscent of the actions of the Russian state after the occupation of Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, and later Kherson and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine. There too, there are abductions, the creation of secret and then completely open prisons, torture, abuse, and mistreatment. The infamous Izolyatsiya concentration camp in the Donetsk region has become particularly notorious. And by the way, let's recall again, the bandits who are Russian mercenaries on this blood-soaked Ukrainian land turned a former center for contemporary art into a concentration camp, because that is exactly how they perceive art and culture. And I think there is nothing surprising about that either. And of course, it's also worth mentioning that such actions perfectly illustrate just how much Russia values the opinions of its puppets. In the occupied territory of Donbass, the Kremlin's mercenaries had virtually no access to the operations of the Federal Security Service and the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation. These were their handlers. And if they detained anyone themselves, of course, the puppet authorities had no influence whatsoever over the fate of those arrested. They could only deal with those whom they had kidnapped and detained themselves. The same thing is happening in Mali. Secondly, there are arrests and detentions for ransom. In fact, ever since the Chechen War, Russian military forces have turned kidnapping people who often have absolutely no connection to political activity into a means of enrichment. This was the case with ordinary civilians in Chechnya. This continued during the war in Ukraine. We found out that the same thing is happening in Mali, when ordinary herders or traders are arrested so that their families can later be forced to pay ransom to the Wagner fighters. Another absolutely clear sign of lawlessness is that the leadership of the Wagner military company can act entirely without regard for anyone when detaining whomever they see fit, and that they can create an entire penitentiary network that is practically accountable to no one and not to the authorities of Mali, nor to the leadership of the Russian Federation itself. Just the other day, a statement appeared saying that the Wagner Group has completed its mission in Mali, but let's not delude ourselves into thinking that the secret prisons of the private military company will disappear from the territory of this African country. No, because there is an African contingent operating in Mali, the overwhelming majority of whom are former Wagner mercenaries. I have no doubt that all these prisons will be taken over by the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, so to speak, on an official basis. And in the same way, no one will take the Malian leadership into account. And in the same way, these prisons will now be used to enrich ordinary Russian officers or Wagner members who will be presented as Russian military personnel. Because as long as you don't drive Russia out, wherever it may be, it will preserve the Gulag as the best and most important form of its own civilization. And of course, in this Gulag, they will play songs by Iosif Kobzon or Mikhail Shufutinsky to showcase the full power of their own cultural achievements. And of course, to drown out the screams and cries of those who are being beaten, tortured, and starved. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel and subscribe to it. Subscribe to my social media, to my Patreon channels, which help support the development of these resources. Make use of the sponsorship feature right here on YouTube. Peace to you all.